Welcome to today's edition of Mir and Rupar. I am David Mir, publisher of The Down Ballot. My co-host is Aaron Rupar, publisher of Public Notice. And thank you all for bearing with us today. We got started an hour late because Donald Trump decided to stage an event on a Friday afternoon right in the middle of when our starting time would normally be. And as you well know, Aaron Rupar has no choice but to cover all Trump events. So, Aaron, thank you as always for your dutiful service.
Yeah.
And I'd be curious to hear if anything notable emerged from that. But to tee things up for today, we're going to talk about the looming DHS shutdown. But before we get there, we have to talk about the Twin Cities and what's going on in Minnesota. And this has obviously been a topic for us on Mir and Rupar for the last several weeks. As you know, Aaron lives in Minneapolis. He's a Minnesota native. So he has had a front row seat to this unfolding nightmare slash what might just be an amazing victory. And the problem, as always, is you can never trust a single word that comes out of any Trump official. And so what Tom Homan claimed this week about ICE and DHS and other affiliated groups supposedly leaving Minnesota and allegedly having extracted concessions from political leaders in the state. Are they telling anything resembling the truth? Have you yet seen any changes on the ground? How do you process all this?
Well, I think that they are definitely not telling the truth with the political concessions part of the talking points they've been using. Both Governor Walz and Mayor Fry have been very resolute that it's the same policies that have been, that are the law of the land here in Minnesota, which is, if there is someone who has a final order of removal and they are convicted of a crime, they are turned over to ICE, but they do not turn over people to ICE who are merely arrested in most instances. So that policy has not changed. It was a little bit bewildering to hear Carolyn Levitt. I mean, I guess you can kind of assume everything that she says is false, but she was on Fox this morning basically saying that, as a result of Homan leaving is only because Minnesota officials agreed to let us into prisons and this and that. And
Right.
so it's highly dishonest. Stephen Miller on Fox was saying similar things last night. But I will say, Homan had his news conference yesterday morning, and it wasn't the first time he had said stuff like that. He had a news conference, I think it was a week prior, where he also kind of promised a drawdown. And I will say, it's a very small sample size. It's just been today, but it does seem like ICE activity has been a little bit tapered off today. They've been quite active still in some of the suburbs around here, but and there have been some sightings around Minneapolis today. Actually, there was kind of disconcerting video I was just watching before we went live where there were a bunch of what looked like military vehicles at the Whipple building here, which has been kind of the locus for a lot of the protesting. There is a detainment facility there where the conditions have not been great and members of Congress have had a hard time getting in there. And it looked like with all these military vehicles, they were kind of staging for something. Now, this could just be some sort of training or who knows exactly what's going on there, because these are videos that are being taken from like outside a fenced off area. But I saw some observers kind of expressing concern about that. Now, if they were to, you have to kind of remember that their line today and yesterday has been that they are drawing down here. So I think even for them, if they were to say stuff like that and then have some sort of huge operation in the community, that would be a pretty bad look, absent some other cause for them to do something like that. So, I do think that there is some intention on their part to draw things down, which is obviously welcome news here. Now, we have to be kind of careful because when you say that, you don't want to sound like kind of like Charlie Brown with the football that gets pulled away time after time. And, I've already seen people kind of chastising each other online for being a little too definitive with statements online about they're definitely drawing down or they're surrendering. So, time will kind of tell. But this has been a pattern that we've seen in other communities that they have tried similar things in, whether it be Chicago or LA County, where at a certain point, the public opinion really turns against them. There's probably diminishing returns on some of these raids as people kind of understand the tactics and how to protect their neighbors or sort of stay out of the line of fire of these agents. So I wouldn't be surprised if they're kind of pulling back and, hopefully this is kind of the end of this phase of quote unquote immigration enforcement and they don't try this in another city. But I seems like this is something that Trump, maybe at the behest of Kristi Noem, wants to try elsewhere. Now, I will note, David, did you have a chance to read that the Wall Street Journal piece on Kristi Noem and Corey Lewandowski
Oh,
today?
yes. Yes. I'm so
My
glad you brought
goodness.
that up. We got to
Yes,
talk about
because
it.
that to me kind of reflects that her star in the administration is waning a bit. And one of the people who comes out of that piece looking at least somewhat more capable than she is Tom Homan, because the narrative that's told in that story is basically that things got so bad politically here in Minnesota for Trump that that was a big reason why Tom Homan was sent up here to kind of clean up Christie's mess a little bit. And he's one of those guys. Sometimes you're kind of tempted to say he's at least has a background in law enforcement, he's more capable. But then you remember the Kava bag story of him
Yeah, right.
basically accepting a bribe before Trump came back to office. So you can never really hand it to a person like that. But Mayor Fry and Governor Walz have met with Homan, which they did not do when Bavino was in charge here, and have said that he at least seemed like someone they could kind of deal with, and that the meetings were positive, and it seems like it led to a positive result. So all of that is good. But I will say, just being on the signal chats here today, there still are ICE vehicles all over town. You probably saw the images from just a couple days ago where ICE got involved in a high-speed chase in a very dense part of St. Paul and ended up being in a multi-car wreck where one of the drivers, who I believe was the target they were chasing, was badly injured. I've not seen an update. They looked like in grave condition when they left the scene, just from videos and photos. But I mean, that was just a couple days ago. So I don't want to be presumptuous, but yeah, I mean, today has been a better day here, and hopefully, there's more of this to come over the weekend and into next week as they continue to draw down the DHS president.
I want to pause for a second because a few people in comments have noted this. We have 5,900 viewers, and we just started 5 minutes ago. And that is a far, far greater number than we have ever had for one of these live streams. Yeah, just yesterday I did a live stream with G. Elliott Morris, and we also had an enormous number,
Hmm.
3,600 folks. So if you are able to, we would love to hear how you found this live stream. Did you get it through the Substack app? Did you follow a link on social media? Let us know. And if you are a paid subscriber to either of our publications, The Down Ballot or Public Notice, you can drop your questions that you might have for us in the chat box. We will try to get to your Q&A as we can. 6,000, totally
That's
nuts.
crazy. Yeah, I'm just
I'm
noticing that.
yeah.
Yeah, I mean, maybe that's the power of doing this at 3 p.m. Eastern instead of 2. In people, I don't know. Maybe Substack. There might be. I'm guessing there might be something a little wonky going with the numbers, because that is like an order of magnitude higher. But I just want to circle back when you mentioned the Trump thing at the top. Um, there's kind of a sense of obligation I have to watch his speeches, but it's also kind of like a physical, like if I'm here and I see him talking in a public setting and I'm not able to cover it, like it makes me feel very uncomfortable. Like I feel almost like a devotion to covering him. So in this case, there wasn't a whole lot going on there. He was speaking at Fort Bragg, which of course he renamed back after the Confederate general, after it was changed during the Biden years. And he did give a very political speech to troops there, including pushing lies about the 2016 election, claiming that he won the popular vote. So there were some good clips from that respect. I always kind of suspect when he's giving a speech to troops that it will be highly inappropriate, which this one was, but thankfully there wasn't a ton of news coming out of it. But thank you, David, for your flexibility, and to the viewers as
Of
well for
course,
tuning in, and mass, as it turns out, tuning in at our
right?
later time slot.
Well, yeah, either something is borked with Substack's counter, or they're really juicing our reach. Let's hope it's number two. I'd be really excited if that's the case. By comparison, the highest number of viewers who ever tuned into anything I've ever done on here was 4,000, and that was on election night last November. And that it's a cumulative count. And so that was over many, many hours of election night coverage. So anyway, knockwood, thank you all for joining us. It's totally awesome. So Aaron, let's sidebar for a second, because you mentioned this Wall Street Journal article. And folks, if you haven't read it, it really is one of these must-read articles that describes the disgustingness and dysfunction, barely even covers it, of the Trump administration. And you just have to kind of pick out a few tidbits. I think the one that I saw flying around blue sky the most was the fact that Kristi Noem, Homeland Security Secretary, she's widely reported to have a very close relationship with Corey Lewandowski, who is a Trump apparatchik from his first campaign days, always seems to still be floating around Trump world in various capacities. And apparently, Lewandowski berated the pilots, the staff who were flying them on I believe, a government plane for losing Christy Nome's blanket. Yes, he was upset that her blankie disappeared, and then apparently fired the pilot who worked for the Coast Guard. I don't understand how you just, if you're a random, civilian member of the government, you can just fire a member of
Yeah.
a military branch.
But
Uh,
is he also cleaning the plane? I mean, that's what I was kind of questioning. Like, why is it the pilot's fault that her blinky wasn't in the plane?
but then here's the super funny punchline on this insane story, which is that wherever they were, they they didn't have anyone else to fly the plane back, so they had to beg the pilot to come back and fly them home. It's but we're laughing about this, but it's utterly beyond fucked up.
Oh yeah.
And this whole story is just filled with vignettes and details about just how screwed up Christy Nome's managing of DHS is. And also, Aaron, there was the part about how she was furious if Tom Homan ever got more media coverage than her,
Mhm.
and demanded that her staff closely monitor her media appearances and I think make sure that she was getting at least as much, if not more, airtime.
Yeah, there were a lot of really, I think the word I used on social media was unbelievable or something like. It's really one of those stories that you have to read on your own. I posted a gift link on Blue Sky, so people
Good.
don't have a Wall Street Journal. They can then go back to that post and find it. But yeah, the other thing that really comes through in that piece. Well, I guess to back up a step here, one of the things that I thought was really interesting about it is it reminded me of a lot of the stories we got from big outlets in Trump 1.0
Yeah.
in terms of like everybody is leaking. The other thing that was really, really funny to me, and David, maybe you noticed this while reading it, is that the Kristi Noem side of the story throughout the piece is told by an unnamed DHS spokesperson, which I saw other people
Uh,
connecting these dots that it was almost certainly Trisha McLaughlin, who's on
okay.
TV all the time. She's a younger woman, but she's on Fox like almost every day. So if you watch Fox for any amount of time, she's like the mouthpiece for DHS. But they never named her, so it's like maybe that was like an effort to kind of keep some distance, that she would speak kind of on background or as a DHS spokesperson, which kind of gives you a sense that these scandals, I mean, this is not kind of like rumor and innuendo. Like this is real stuff that's
Yeah.
going on. The other one that was really funny to me, the whole bottom part of the piece is about Corey Lewandowski's quest to obtain a gun and badge.
Right.
Even though he's not an official DHS employee, he's like a special advisor. And the piece gets into how even to the present day, like he's tried like 3 or 4 different ways to try and get a gun and a badge, and it just hasn't worked out. It's even some of the people who have not been able to deliver on this have been demoted. They've like punished people who have been able to come up with the gun and badge for him. So I mean, it's just a clown show all the way through. And one of the things that also jumped out though to kind of bring this full circle with the Minneapolis situation is that she was one of the architects of Metro Surge, and Bavino was kind of her person that was running point, both in LA, Chicago, and now in Minneapolis. But as things really got bad, and Trump apparently was getting more and more upset about, just the bad images and the bad polling and the bad press, that her strategy, instead of kind of changing tactics, was to do press appearances where she would talk about other things. It gets into that very surreal news conference she gave on the day that Alex Preddy was killed, where, of course, at that same time, there was a storm on the East Coast, the big winter storm that kind of grounded flights and whatnot. But, the whole world was talking about the Alex Preddy thing, which everybody saw on video that day. But she was very insistent with her aides to like give her, kind of a backdrop for her news conference that had a bunch of stuff related to the storm. And she led her remarks by talking about the storm and encouraged reporters to ask her questions about the storm. So there's just kind of like almost like living in like a alternative reality aspect to the way that she's conducting herself. And then even today, so the story drops in the Wall Street Journal. It was probably the number one talked about political story, across different social media platforms. And then she gave a news conference just like an hour ago, which I watched down in Arizona, that was about election security, just like very randomly, which included a placard of her and Trump. And the heading on the placard was passed the Save America Act. But when you kind of looked at the optics of it, I mean, I think she really kind of views herself potentially as being like his successor, or maybe the 2028 candidate. But I mean, that to me is just like unfathomable, given that she makes JD Vance almost seem likable by comparison. I mean, I know Republican politics is pretty messed up, but I mean, geez, I will go on record right now and say if Kristi Noem, and maybe I'll live to regret this, if she is Republican nominee in 2028, I will move to Canada. Like that will be that's it for me. If Kristi Noem is the person, I don't think it's going to happen. I don't want to move to Canada. I probably won't, but I need to give people a reason to keep tuning in for a few more years. So I will go on record and make that promise that if she ends up being the nominee, I will do that. I don't think it's going to happen, but it's just like completely delusional. And then I posted this clip too. There was a reporter, so she takes questions today from reporters. And one of the reporters asked her, why did you even have this news conference today? They had to bus us out to the secure facility of some sort of elections office that she was in. And then the reporter said, you were just in Arizona last week at the border. Like we did a press conference there. And then you summoned us here. Like this isn't even like top secret. Like there's going to be a government shutdown and we're talking about election security. Like what, and Noam kind of had this pat response of like, this is our critical infrastructure and elections are part of our national security. And it was just completely surreal all the way down. Even the reporters are kind of revolting at this point. So I have long been of the opinion that I think Trump is very reluctant to fire anybody this time around because I think he sees that as a sign of weakness, that he made bad picks. And I think he wants there to be kind of a sense of inevitability about all these people who are, Stephen Miller. And I was going to say Sean Duffy, but I mean, he's probably a kind of thin ice too. It seems like with the Border Patrol and FAA debacle down in El Paso, that doesn't seem like the type of story Trump likes that much. But no, it does increasingly seem to me like she's on thin ice. I think her news conference today was an attempt to kind of like change the topic a little bit. From the scandal to kind of more germane DHS matters. But it's really hard to think of anything that she's doing that even like the base is really that thrilled about at this point. So when you put that all together, it reminded me a lot, like I said, of the stories you saw in 1.0 where the leaks really start intensifying, when a person is kind of marked for being on their way out. And it left me with that vibe that I wouldn't be shocked. I don't think it's going to happen like over the weekend or early next week, but if there probably are odds somewhere in terms of who the first cabinet member to be fired is going to be. And for me, I would wager on her at this point.
Yeah, I know those articles that you're talking about, the ones in the Washington Post that, in the sixth paragraph, it would say this reporting is based on discussions with 24 different senior yada yada. So I do want to circle back to the Twin Cities, though, because regardless of the exact details of what's happening right now, from my perspective as an outsider, I have to view this as an enormous, enormous win for the people of Minneapolis and St. Paul and the whole region and Minnesota in general and Americans, period, because you guys have these guys on the run and you did it as ordinary citizens. You overcame your fears and showed immense courage despite incredibly dangerous, deadly threats. And you organized in extraordinary ways, so much so that these lunatics started publishing articles claiming that Minnesotans were using military grade intelligence tactics, which is, signal chats, like you were saying, and
Yeah.
whistles. And it's worked. And also, beyond that, you have taught the rest of us what to do when they come to our cities. And there are so many lessons to be learned on such a fast time scale. I read a fascinating op-ed just the other day. I don't know if you saw this one, Aaron, in a local publication from a guy who was talking about these DIY traffic roadblocks that people have been setting up. Do you know what I'm talking about here?
I'm not sure I read this op-ed. I'm aware of the roadblocks.
Yeah. So this is something that folks may not know about, but Aaron, you've talked about the incredibly reckless driving that these ICE and other vehicles, they're barreling down streets, blasting through intersections, driving the wrong way down streets. And so folks have taken it upon themselves, community members, folks in local neighborhoods, to essentially set up roundabouts at intersections. And sometimes the cops come and remove them, the local cops, that is, and then they go and set them right back up. And the fact that people are taking things into their hands in such a concrete way and risking, arrest by local law enforcement is really, really remarkable to me. I mean, to me, it read like something straight out of the Paris Commune. from the 19th century.
Yeah, no, and I really thought that that was a good idea. They ended up being quite divisive, depending on who you talk to, in the
Huh.
sense that people thought it was like going too far, or it was kind of like fostering a sense of lawlessness. But my pushback was, I mean, just like look around at what's happening here, like, and that was kind of a frustrating thing with like the police chief here, like, who's very good on TV, Brian O'Hara, and I think his heart seems to be in the right place, but he kind of fell back oftentimes during his public appearances on the line that the police were just so vastly outnumbered that it was kind of problematic to ask them to intervene too much with what ICE and CBP were up to. So that when you're kind of in that state of affairs where like even the local cops are kind of ceding the terrain to these brutal thugs, like people do have to get creative,
Yep.
and the ICE vehicles. I mean, the other thing that's really been that I see all over in the neighborhood here in signal groups, but that everybody is kind of knows how to do at this point is to run plate checks on cars, because the first couple weeks of the occupation here, a lot of the plates were Texas, Florida, like they were kind of
Right.
out of state plates. But then as this has gone along longer and longer, it seemed like ICE and CBP got better kind of blending in, where the telltale sign was like the heavily tinted windows, but the plates weren't always a
Sure.
giveaway, because a lot of times they'd have local, Minnesota plates, but you could still run them through a directory, and cars that were registered with ICE would have a hit for that. So then you could spread the word on the chats. And you're right. I think that the signal group kind of organization, in terms of on a grassroots neighborhood level, has been so successful that when Ron Johnson had Keith Ellison before him in that hearing a couple days ago, I mean, he was asking leading lines of questions, along the lines of, is this like obstructing law enforcement, these people in these signal groups? I think that's kind of a reach, but the mask really, I thought, slipped during that hearing, where Johnson was very, very aggressive towards Keith Ellison. But I think part of what set him off was he had this line of questioning to Keith Ellison, which was like, am I correct that you encourage people to go out there and protest? And Keith Ellison was like, yeah, I'm a fan of the First Amendment. Like, of course. Why wouldn't I do that, given what was happening? And then it led to Johnson. I posted a clip of this later where he called Keith Ellison disgusting and was kind of yelling at him. But the mask was kind of slipping there, where it's like, these guys just don't like the Constitution, basically.
Yep.
If it's a problem that you're exercising your free speech rights, or objecting to the fact that these ICE and CBP agents are basically getting permission slips from their own agencies instead of getting warrants, just kind of basic rights that I think a lot of us have taken for granted, seem to be kind of squarely in the crosshairs. And the whole like masking thing. I mean, the fact that Republicans like Johnson are comfortable with basically secret police operating in this country, when that has never been anything that we've needed in the past. And the other thing that really came through in that hearing, and this has been kind of a constant whenever Republicans have talked about this publicly, is this idea that, oh, of course, ICE and CBP need masks because they're being doxxed and people are harassing their families. And that hasn't happened at all. I don't think there's been a single news story of any ICE or CBP agent who has had any sort of direct threat or harassment at their house or of their family. So, they kind of have this like daydream that they're using to justify, the introduction of secret police into America, when I think we can all kind of understand that the only reason they need to have those sorts of protections or their identities veiled is because they're committing crimes. If you're acting lawfully and just doing normal law enforcement, you don't need that stuff. And even then, again, if there was some sort of plague of harassment threats against ICE or CBP agents, maybe there would be something to talk about there. At least you could have a conversation about it. But the fact that they're citing kind of these daydreams that they have, or thought experiments, as reasons to put American citizens, either people who are supporting immigrants themselves, or just protesters, in danger, I think really kind of speaks to how far off the deep end we are here.
I'm glad you brought up the masks, because that's a perfect segue to talk about this DHS shutdown, which is almost certain to happen. The congressional leaders, including Republicans, have said that there is no compromise in sight. I think maybe it might be useful, Aaron, if we recapped a little bit about what brought us to this moment in terms of just DHS specifically being on the block.
Yeah, so it's something like, I think 97% of the federal government is funded through the appropriations bills that Congress passed. But DHS obviously has come under scrutiny based mostly on what's happening here in Minnesota. But of course, ICE has operated in other states and communities throughout the country, where, this became obviously a leverage point for Democrats who feel like public opinion is on their side, which it is, to try to force through at least kind of procedural changes with ICE and CBP in terms of unmasking, in terms of warrant requirements. There's been discussion of kind of banning the roving patrols, which are not necessarily responding to like specific incidents or targeting people, but are just kind of out in the community, which leads to these confrontations that we have seen, or them, trying to burst into businesses and, tear gassing entire intersections and things like that. So that's where we basically are. Is the DHS portion of the federal government is left unfunded as of midnight tonight, and it would mostly affect TSA, the Coast Guard, I think some other kind of minor agencies as well. The FAA, which I just learned today, is actually funded through a different agency. It's not under DHS. So, maybe that'll lead to some of the impacts for air travelers, which was a big factor with the shutdown that happened in the fall, not being quite as severe this time around. But, it seems like it'd be reasonable to expect longer lines at airports going through TSA, which I think will be kind of one of the first, impacts that people will feel, in their day-to-day lives from stemming from the shutdown. But, it's a little bit, and this is, I think, been signified in the fact that you have a lot of members of Congress who right now are in Germany for the Munich Security Conference, which I've been watching part of the day today. Most of them went home. I saw just before we went live, Hakeem Jeffries was doing a news conference basically in an empty Capitol, which was kind of an unusual backdrop, very quiet. Because, part of it is that the shutdown that we had in the fall obviously affected, basically the entirety of the federal government. So it led to kind of more urgency. But this is one where I think, because, and it has been a few, Alex Preddy was killed, like 3 or 4 weeks ago now. There's still been some terrible things happening here. I mentioned the car accident from a couple days ago, in a very dense part of St. Paul that seemed totally out of control. But I think Republicans are kind of thinking like, well, the worst of this is behind us. And, it does seem like we sent Tom Homan up to Minnesota and he kind of got things under control. And I think there's still kind of a perception that they want to put Democrats in a position where they're fighting for less restrictive immigration enforcement, because I still think they kind of view that as like a winning issue, being a hardliner on the border and on immigration. And I think on the flip side, Democrats are saying, look, we're making very basic asks of DHS here, the warrant requirements, the masking, some of the tactics that are not really traditional law enforcement tactics that seem almost more like, kind of you're operating as a military organization in occupied territory sort of thing. So, that's basically where we're at, but there doesn't seem to be a lot of movement to get anything done. So I think this could last a while. Although I do wonder, again, I think that the one thing that's going to put pressure on politicians to find some sort of deal here will probably be the airport lines getting out of control as TSA isn't paid. So that's usually how these shutdowns end, is that the public pressure builds. It's not like it was in the fall where, you had the concern about FAA and you had Sean Duffy demanding that a number of major airlines cut their flights by 10%. But I do think that'll be the thing as we get further and further into this. Once the government shuts down at midnight, that might put some pressure on a deal ultimately being struck. One other thing I should mention before I kick it back to you is that because the big beautiful bill, funded ICE and CBP out of, they have basically a huge slush fund to work with. I don't get the sense that this is going to, it's not like, ICE is going to run out of money and they're going to have to pull in all of their, basically lay off all of their, right. So, I mean, that is kind of one of the weird dynamics of this. And, I've seen guys like Fetterman, I think has been kind of a leader and being almost kind of like nihilistic about this, where he's like, well, they got their money anyway, so I'm not going to vote to shut down the government because what good does it do? But it's not so much about the funding. It's more about kind of the procedures and practices. And so I think that's why Dems think they have some leverage here to at least get those tangible changes.
And the polls consistently show that the kinds of things that Democrats are demanding, such as the end to masking, are very, very popular. And I think that Republicans will face a very difficult time trying to turn this into a border security issue, because it's Republicans who have succeeded in making the border recede in the public consciousness by having this ICE national terror campaign, now particularly focused in Minnesota. So I think it's just not top of mind anymore. It's almost like they want to return to 2024, and they've ensured that that can't happen. And the other side is the pressure that congressional Democrats ought to feel. I don't know to what extent they do feel, and different types of Democrats in Congress, I'm sure, feel different things. We have seen a lot of disappointing statements and actions from folks like Jeffries and Schumer, while other members have been a lot more muscular on these kinds of issues. But I want to tie this into an important election result that we just saw this week. So last week, there was a Democratic primary in New Jersey's 11th congressional district. This was the seat that Mikey Sherrill held. And of course, she won the governor's race in New Jersey last year. So it became vacant, and there's a special election. And the candidate who won is a progressive activist named Analilia Mejia. And it was a huge, huge upset. She was badly outspent by all the other major candidates. And she wound up winning in this big split field. And she took by far the most aggressive stance about ICE. I mean, you go to her homepage, I'm pretty sure it's abolish ICE in her ads. And it's a message that definitely resonated. And she wasn't also the only candidate calling for abolish ICE. So she won with about 29% of the vote. But I am quite certain that her views on ICE were representative of a majority of Democratic primary voters in this district. And so you translate that out to other districts and other states in the nation. Democratic primary electorates tend to look fairly similar, in a very broad sense from one place to the next. New Jersey's 11th overall is a rather moderate district with something of a blue lean. Mejia will definitely be the favorite in the general election in April, but the primary voters there are just as worked up in suburban New Jersey about ICE as they are in downtown Minneapolis, and so I hope that Democrats are paying attention to what went down in that race, because incumbents who don't take a strong stance against curbing ICE's abuses are really going to put themselves in jeopardy of losing to primary challengers. And we have seen tons and tons of strong primary challengers emerge to incumbent Democrats. But you know what? If if these Democrats don't want to take the message to heart, then more of them are going to lose.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. I think there's a little bit of kind of the PTSD from abolish the police, as being at least a slogan. I mean, it wasn't actually something that was tried
You mean
in very
defund?
many places. Yes, defund the police from kind of the post George Floyd, which was very
Yep.
salient here in Minneapolis, and that was one of the things that kind of set Jacob Hart of Jacob Fry apart from other Democrats was that he never supported that, and kind of made him. He's still not very popular with like the activist base here. I think kind of in part because of that. And he's been one who has talked about how with ICE, there has to be. This is kind of what you hear from a lot of Democrats. There has to be some form of immigration enforcement, and we have to think about what that looks like. It wouldn't look like this current iteration of ICE, and I do think that that's true. I mean, you're not going to have no immigration enforcement whatsoever. That would obviously that'd be sort of an invitation to chaos. But abolish ICE, from what I have gathered, we've done a little bit of coverage of this in newsletter over the months. Polls way better than defund the police ever did.
Oh yeah.
And so, I do think kind of with rank and file, I mean, that's even the case for like Tina Smith and Klobuchar here. They haven't really embraced the abolish ICE mentality. But, I think there was some polling I saw last week where it wasn't quite a majority view, but it's, it's like a plurality, favors abolish ICE over, kind of the idea that ICE needs to be, funded even more, is doing great work out there. So, like, I guess there is kind of the idea is, would that be something that Republicans would kind of welcome if that becomes something that in primary campaigns really sets apart the more moderate from the more progressive wing of the party? And could they kind of leverage that to recycle some of the attacks that they did in 2020? Although it's worth remembering that 2020 was a very bad cycle for Republicans, where Democrats ended up having a trifecta when the smoke cleared in January after the specials in Georgia. So sometimes it's kind of like, we think back on that and, oh, that was such a disaster for Democrats, the whole defund the police, but, was it really? Because Democrats did pretty well right up until 2024. And by then, that was kind of a faint memory. The whole, George Floyd and the funding of the police controversy around the time. So, yeah, that's interesting. And I that probably accords with your sense of things too, that the polling on abolish ICE is a lot stronger than defunding the police ever was.
Yeah, and I want to be clear. You're absolutely right. I want to be clear. I'm not suggesting that I think Democrats in Congress right now leading this shutdown fight. I'm not suggesting that I think they will or should start demanding abolish ICE. And I actually don't. I think that would be counterproductive, because then you set yourself up for failure, because that's just not possible in the current environment. But what I am saying is that if you have a Democratic base that is very, very anti-ICE, then I think you need to get some concessions out of Republicans and show that you're capable of winning a fight here by, let's say, securing a ban on masking. That if people are this angry, you have to show something for it, and they may not be able to. You know, I mean, it's Congress. We've been disappointed many times in the past. We'll see what happens, but I also want to stress. I think that the masks is really important because yes, it's symbolic, but symbols have huge importance. Otherwise, we wouldn't care about symbols. But also, you know, as you were alluding to earlier, Aaron, why do they feel the need to wear these masks? What are they afraid of? And if they are afraid, and I believe that they are, then maybe they would be a little less trigger happy if they can't wear masks. Maybe they would be a little less thuggish because they really are such wimps ultimately.
Yeah, and there was developments just today with the third person, which hasn't gotten nearly as much coverage as Renee Good or Alex Preddy, but the third man who was shot here in the Twin Cities by DHS. That there's actually an investigation of the officer there because today it was revealed that he basically lied under oath about the circumstances of what
Right.
happened there, which I think that kind of speaks to the culture of impunity and probably thinking there would never be any accountability for this and that you'd be protected by Trump, which, of course, Trump, I guess it depends if it's state or federal charges. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if Trump tried to pardon the officer involved there. But you do wonder with the masking, is it also in part because a lot of the people who have been hired were, January 6th pardonees kind of thing, or they have other, criminal background in some way that would be kind of shameful, if their identities were more out there publicly. Where, of course, with the two CBP officers who shot Alex Preddy, it took investigative reporting to figure out who they were. I think it was Jacqueline Sweet, who's a contributor to The Intercept, went back
Right.
and they had, some sort of marking. It wasn't really a badge number, but some sort of number on their uniform. And then she went back and traced one of the officers to a previous violent incident that occurred a couple weeks prior, and from there
Right.
was able to
Right.
identify them. But that's what we're dealing with here. We're not dealing with a government that's even going to be transparent with kind of the bare minimum of the identities involved. And I think you're right. You made a great point with like the need for there to be some sort of win that you can take back to the base. Because with the shutdown that occurred in the fall, it's interesting to kind of think back in hindsight there, because Schumer's position, which was widely reviled among Democrats at the time, was that this was going to make Republicans basically own the healthcare issue in a bad way, where they were going to be responsible for the spiking premiums. It'd be something that Democrats could run on, this year. And I'm not sure he was like totally wrong there. Obviously, there's a lot of kind of human carnage in the meantime with people who are losing their health insurance, which I think is up, was projected to be up into the millions of people
Yeah.
as the premium spike. But that was kind of it was very unsatisfying, when that was kind of what was brought back to base Democrats as well. At least we got like a political win out of this. And I don't think that's going to be enough this time. And, it does seem like the asks that Jeffries in particular, who was just articulating them before he went live, is making are extremely straightforward, which was kind of his point too, with the unmasking and the warrants and, some of the tactics. And so those do seem like things that, you can make a lot of hay out of messaging on that. And then, if Republicans aren't willing to kind of even meet you partway there on that stuff, hopefully that is something that, either they meet you part way, in which case you have a tangible win you can bring back to the base, or they don't, in which case, like, clearly the party is so far gone that, they're endorsing secret police and kind of these, gangland style shootings in the street. And hopefully that would kind of break through to people as we enter a midterm cycle. So, yeah, I mean, it does seem like a pretty strong hand that Democrats have. But what the leverage points are going to be for Republicans, remains a little unclear to me. Maybe again, with the exception of like long lines at the airport, sort of thing.
So I want to sort of step back a little bit here because one thing that I think Democrats could also be much better at communicating is not just what they're going to do now, but what they'll do when they take back power. And you have some Democrats who have talked about this very vocally. In particular, I think of Senator Chris Murphy from Connecticut and more recently Representative Jason Crow from Colorado. Jason Crow was one of the veterans who was targeted by the administration for that video, along with Senator Mark Kelly and several others, uh, exhorting current active duty members to reject illegal orders that they might receive from their superiors. And they were utterly vindicated. in the failure for the DOJ to get indictments against them. And Jason Crow was livid, and his tone and attitude reflected the kind of anger that people like us, and I'm sure everyone tuning in to this huge live stream, feel, which is fuck these guys. I can't remember his exact words, but he basically said, I'm taking names. And what he meant by that was, we're going to win back the House in November. We're going to have subpoena power. We are going to be able to investigate the hell out of these guys. And we're going to remember everyone who has uh, bought into this fascist movement attempting to take over and ruin America. And there will be consequences for those people. And so, even if you're out of power right now, talk about what you're going to do when you're back in power. And it can't just be, oh, we're going to make healthcare more affordable for people. It has to also include accountability and criminal liability where appropriate, which is for a lot of people for this administration.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I mean, I think not to get too down into kind of the recriminations about the past, but I think Biden's mentality after he won in 2020 was to sort of hope that normalcy would just kind of return by virtue of
Yep.
having the adults back in charge. And you do kind of wonder how history could have been different had he made a stronger choice for Attorney General than
Oh, yeah.
Merrick Garland, who would have prosecuted Trump more aggressively, or if we just could. It's actually the 5-year anniversary today, which I was reminded of earlier, of the vote to not convict Trump in the Senate
Awesome.
with his second impeachment. Had McConnell just kind of whipped the votes there,
Yep.
it'd be kind of sunshine and rainbows and lollipops for everyone today instead of being under occupation here in Minneapolis for the past couple months. But yeah, because that is, I think, a really important kind of forward-looking message, one of accountability, and that for the crimes that have been committed, there will be justice that is sought, when Democrats have power to do so. And you're right that I think kind of vague promises of lowering healthcare costs, or I mean, obviously affordability is potent too, and I don't want to downplay that, but I think you have to have some meat on the bone, and that seems like a kind of a low lying fruit area that isn't necessarily like a progressive versus moderate thing. It's just like a justice thing, and it has been really heartening to see. It's obviously easier to be unified when you're kind of unified in opposition to something a lot of the time. And but I have been impressed even here in Minneapolis, where left wing politics here is very fractious. And we had a mayoral campaign just a few months ago that was quite divisive, because you had Omar Fateh, who is more of like the DSA type candidate. Then you had Fry, who is more kind of a moderate Democrat, pro business. But the way that everybody really has kind of come together, to support neighbors, and behind kind of a unified message of opposition to what Trump and the administration are doing, has been kind of inspiring. I don't expect that to last forever, but I do think that is one area with accountability and justice that can unify, kind of the entire party behind something that, is kind of concrete. It isn't sort of a policy plan that might never be enacted. It's something that Democrats will have the power to do, assuming they can at least, take back the presidency, and possibly more than that, in 2028. And in the meantime, hopefully the House and the Senate in the months to come here.
So we got to wrap up in a couple of minutes. I will say one heartening sign is that in regard to this DHS shutdown, some of the Democratic senators, in fact, I think really all of them except for Fetterman, who had been anti-shutdown in the fall, almost immediately came out and said, "No, I'm against this. We something has to change here." And so, who knows whether the Gene Shaheens of the world will stay strong in that point of view? But there is a lot more unity among the Democratic Senate caucus than there was the last time. Fetterman, I mean, he's a joke at this point. He has said he'll never vote to shut down the government, and my response to that always is, well, what if the GOP's budget bill says abortion is banned in all 50 states? You still going to vote for that? No one's bothered to ask him that question, and who knows how he would even answer. But the other 46 Democratic senators seem to be of one mind on this, which is rare.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, that's been my sense too. I mean, these things can change, because it seemed like the senators were kind of one mind, last shutdown until they weren't. And, the Cave Caucus were sort of kind of trickling out to reporters that there was interest in a deal. So it's just, it's easier to hold strong when there isn't necessarily the same pain points that we're used to seeing in
Yeah.
shutdowns. And that seems like that's going to be the case this time, at least for a little while. So, and hopefully, I mean, there's other things that could be part of a deal here, where it could even be personnel changes at DHS. I mean, maybe this is part of what leads to the end of Christy Noem being in charge there. There could be a deal where she steps down, or Trump fires her or something like that. So, but I think the ones that are most straightforward and that would have the most impact for the positive in terms of our country are the warrant requirements, the unmasking, because we just need to get to a place where the administration has a little more kind of respect for the rule of law and guardrails that we have assumed that were part of our country until very recently. And so I think that'd be the most positive outcome, is using whatever leverage Democrats have to make ICE at least operate more like a normal law enforcement agency, until Democrats have enough power to actually possibly abolish it or radically reimagine it, which won't happen anytime real soon. But elections are only like 10 months away, and
Yep.
especially if you have both chambers, you can really kind of throw sand into the gears pretty quickly there. So, and and to end it on a hopeful note, although it reflects kind of bad things happening in the country, I think Trump's Pew numbers yesterday hit a new all-time low. I mean, he's down into the 30s at this point, and I'm sure, G. Elliott Morris might have a little more to say on this, but, we're kind of entering the zone where it's like a wave territory. If Trump's at 36%, I'd say it's probably about a coin flip for the Senate at that point, and then the House would be a lock. So a lot can change, but, it seems like Trump is really kind of tanking. And, even today having some relatively good economic news where inflation is kind of more in step with target rate, the 2.5% target than it has been when it's up around 3. I mean, even that doesn't really seem to be breaking through, because I think people have a broad sense that the economy isn't great, and as long as that's the case, it's hard to really see how those numbers are going to get better because there's so much unrest in the country. The thing that he always kind of relied upon in his first term as kind of his, backstop, that the economy was solid, doesn't really seem to be the same as it was back then for him. So he hasn't done himself any favors with the way he's handled things here in Minneapolis, and it's a good thing that seems to be, at least for the moment, kind of waning, and that maybe a little bit more normalcy can happen here. But as kind of a final thing that I would say to our nearly 8,000 viewers today is that if you have been inspired by what's been going on here with the resistance in Minnesota, the way the community has come together here, it would really mean a lot at some point. If you have opportunities to spend money on small businesses here, to visit something like that. I know the business community, especially small businesses, have been really hammered here. A number of restaurants have already closed, just during the 2 months that Operation Metro Surge has been going on here. And the mayor has talked about that as well, that, it's like probably up in the hundreds of millions of dollars of business activity that has been lost and will continue to be lost. So that's one thing that people from out of the area can do, in the months to come, to help us get kind of back on our feet and going again here.
I want to say I'm a born and raised New Yorker. I lived here my whole life. I'm very hard to impress when it comes to visiting other cities. But I visited Minneapolis a couple of years ago. Aaron, it's a dope city. I really liked it. I mean, it's really cool. It has a ton to offer. And also, we went in the middle of summer and the weather was great. It was so much cooler. So, yeah, I strongly, strongly second what Aaron says. 8,000 viewers, man. I really
There
hope
we
that
go.
there isn't some bug in the system at Substack. You know what? I'm going to choose to believe.
Well,
It's too good to check.
someone mentioned in the comments a while back that Apple TV now has some sort of Substack integration.
Yes,
So
that's
there's a
correct.
commenter saying that was identifying that as the reason for which, if true, that seems legit. So great.
Yeah.
We
If you're watching
thank
us,
you to the 8,000 who tuned in.
if you're watching us on Apple TV or Substack TV, please let us know. But thank you for tuning us in here in Rupar. Once again, if you have not subscribed to Aaron's publication, publicnotice.co, absolutely please do. And if you're a Public Notice subscriber and you haven't subscribed to the Down Ballot, we're at the-downballot.com. Our normal time is 2 p.m. Eastern, 1 p.m. Central on Fridays. And we will be back next Friday with another show. Have a fantastic weekend, everyone. Stay safe.
Have a great weekend.